What is it that makes a bonsai good? What is it that makes one tree better than another? Is it some sort of list of characteristics? Is it a more formulaic approach? Or is it something more intangible and indescribable? In this episode of Bonsai-U, we'll attempt to answer all of these questions and more. I think probably one of the best places to start is to look at what makes a bonsai technically good. I remember when I first arrived in Japan for my apprenticeship back in 2008, one of the first phrases that I overheard my oyakata Fujikawa-san saying to a customer when assessing a tree in the nursery was, "Iki desu ne," or in Kansai dialect, as Fujikawa-san would say, "Eiki ana." It basically translates to, "This is a really good tree, huh?" And I thought at the time, like, what exactly does that mean? What exactly is that referring to? So I think all of us are kind of familiar with the rules of bonsai. We hear about it all the time. And a lot of these rules stem from, I think, at least in a Western context, the teachings of John Naka, especially in his book, Bonsai Techniques 1, which was released all the way back in 1973. In that book, John Naka talks about all of the characteristics that make up a quote-unquote good bonsai. And it's a very formulaic approach when it comes to building bonsai, kind of a paint-by-numbers approach, which for the time and for distilling this information from a Japanese context into a Western and specifically American context, it was a great distillation of that information. It provided a very simple and easy set of quote-unquote rules to follow to build out the best possible bonsai. Now, in terms of some of the rules that John Naka discussed in that book, he talked a lot about things like the rule of thirds, for example, which is a little bit different when it comes to the rule of thirds in, say, photography and art and design. What John Naka was specifically referring to was in assessing a tree from the bottom to the top of the plant, looking at the bottom third of the tree or the bottom third of the trunk being essentially open and free of branching and foliage, the central third of the tree having a good number of basic branches where some of the foliage starts to block the trunk a little bit, and then the last third of the trunk is essentially covered by foliage all the way to the apex. Now, again, this is a really good, basic, simple approach, but does it actually apply across the board when it comes to assessing what a good tree is or a good bonsai is versus a bad bonsai? Now, some of the other rules that I think all of us are familiar with when it comes to basic paint-by-numbers building of a bonsai tree are things like looking at basically the base of the tree working way up to the trunk, having a wide nabari or surface root structure at the bottom of the tree, having good movement and taper within the trunk where the base is thicker and it gets smaller in terms of diameter as you move towards the apex. Looking at branching, considering, for example, having branching on the outside of curves rather than emanating from the inside of a curve. Looking at branches that do not cross the trunk, for example. If you're building a multi-trunk tree, not allowing those trunks to cross one another. All of these things sort of fall into what John Naka talked about and what you hear a lot about both in books and online in regards to the, again, quote-unquote rules of bonsai. But do these rules really apply, and do they really apply at the highest level when it comes to building a good quality bonsai? I think there is a major common misunderstanding in the West, particularly in the United States, about what makes a good quality bonsai. And it's, again, this idea that following these sort of rules and basic sort of structural setup for a tree is going to lead to the best possible outcome when building a bonsai. This, I think, really stems from the fact that a vast majority of the trees that have been brought over from Japan to the United States, both before we had the really strict quarantine laws in the 80s and 90s, and into the current day, from 2000 onward with our very strict quarantine laws, is that a vast majority of the trees that have come in have been field-grown trees, mass production trees. The reason being is that they're cheap in Japan because there's so many of them, they've been overproduced, so it's easy to acquire them for relatively relatively cheap prices to bring them into the United States. So when people see those trees come to the United States and then get resold, for example, those trees have to be resold at a profit in the US. And it costs a lot of money to import them, put them through the quarantine process. You're going to end up losing a lot of those trees because they get weak, because they have to be bare rooted in Japan before they're brought to the United States. So by the time they go up on the retail market in the US, they're 10, 20, sometimes 30 times what the value of that tree would be in Japan, even at a retail price. So from that perspective, people see those trees, they think, this is a tree that was brought in from Japan, it's a very expensive tree, that must equate to quality. And that's in fact not the case at all. Those trees again are mass production trees, most of which have come from Takamatsu down in Shikoku. Now again, those trees are built with this sort of John Naka era idea of paint by numbers, essentially basic trunks, S curves in the trunks, branches emanating from the outside of those curves, a little bit of taper in the trunks, and a nice sort of general canopy that is easy to understand. But easy to understand does not necessarily mean good quality. Now what about comparing bonsai art to other forms of art like photography, sculpture, or painting? Are there some similarities in characteristics that would make a quality bonsai better if we took those same elements from those other art forms and applied them to bonsai? So for example, I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with the idea of building your trees out with the general shape of a scalene triangle, meaning that none of the three sides are the same length. Well, in general, this is very true. This will actually give you kind of a basic setup for building, say, directionality within the tree or asymmetry within a tree. It's very similar when we're talking about, say, sculpture or painting or, again, photography. That being said, you can really very easily lock yourself into, again, this very formulaic approach to building your trees where all of the canopies, all of the foliage pads, everything within the plant falls into larger and smaller scalene triangles. Now, in general, again, this is going to give you a good setup, but take, for example, this garden here in Kyoto at Daitoku-ji. This is Hoshun-in, public bonsai collection here that you can come visit if you visit the city. Many of the trees in this collection here, if not most of them, do not fall into that scalene triangle shape. As a matter of fact, some of the oldest trees in this collection are some flowering apricots that are wild, just incredibly sort of naturalistic trees that have been built essentially by man from the start, but they don't have that sort of standard scalene triangle shape that's been overlaid onto the top of the design. So they're still quality trees, they're beautiful plants, but they don't fit into that formulaic approach at all. Now, we could also assess bonsai by using something like the Fibonacci sequence or by applying the golden ratio or the rule of thirds, not John Naka's rule of thirds, but the rule of thirds that is utilized quite often in photography to a bonsai. And again, these do sort of conceptually apply when it comes to building, say, asymmetry, for example, or balance and flow within a tree, but they aren't the end-all be-all. So to try to force a tree into those shapes or into these sequences or into some sort of mathematical formulation is really not going to yield you the best quality results. Now, what about the styles of bonsai? If a tree falls into the sort of ideal of a specific style, say moyogi, for example, as an informal upright, or chokkan as a formal upright, or kengai as a cascade, does that then make that tree a quality bonsai? Well, here in the Japanese context anyway, quite often, at least from my experience, these styles of bonsai, specific names for a style, will be retroactively applied to a tree, and the tree won't necessarily be built to fit the style. Rather than hearing that though, what you're typically going to hear is a tree described as, let's say, sugata ga iki, right? A tree with a good shape to it. Or this tree, for example, might be referred to as shareteru, which means a very classy tree. Not classic or classical in the sense of a style, but more of a feeling that's applied to the plant. So rather than thinking in terms of strict styles for bonsai, I would think more in terms of the aesthetic feeling that the tree gives you as the viewer. And I think this is probably a more positive way of assessing whether a tree is quality or not. Now, returning to that phrase that I mentioned earlier in Japanese, iki desu ne, or eiki ana in Kansai dialect, meaning this is a good tree, huh? When it comes to whether or not the Japanese would apply that to bonsai that are formulaic and how they are built, you really won't ever hear them use that phrase describing a tree that was, say, mass-produced in Shikoku. As a matter of fact, you won't see any of those trees at the highest level exhibitions here in Japan, like the Kokufu 10 or the Taikan 10. So that's a completely separate industry from what we would consider to be the actual true bonsai art industry here in Japan. So when you go to an exhibition, for example, like the Kokufu, we take our tour groups there every year. Inevitably, when people come out from seeing the exhibition for the first time, without a doubt, I will hear at least half the people on the tour say, none of these trees follow any of the rules that I was taught. They're all exquisitely beautiful, they're exquisitely displayed, they're just incredible to look at, they give me an incredible feeling, but none of them follow any of those rules. And why is that the case? And how were those trees built that way to give me that feeling without looking, contrived or overwrought? They look so naturalistic but refined. And this, to me, is the start of assessing whether or not a tree is good or bad as a bonsai. It's again, whether or not that tree gives you a certain feeling, and I think more importantly, whether or not the tree is memorable. So the next question then is, well, what exactly makes a tree memorable? And is every tree that's memorable to me going to be memorable to somebody else? And of course, this gets into the very subjective nature of bonsai as an art form, and this is true for all forms of art. But I think that what we can say is that when it comes to whether or not a tree is good or good quality, it really is that sort of gut punch factor that you as an individual get when you view a tree. And this could be influenced by your particular cultural context. It could be influenced by an experience that you had growing up. Maybe you had a tree in the field behind your house that was the perfect tree for climbing and hanging a tire swing on, and it was the lone sort of deciduous broadleaf tree out in the middle of a field that had a big beautiful canopy. And when you see something like that represented in miniature form, it speaks to you in a very specific way. Now, this is a good starting point, I think, when it comes to assessing whether or not the tree is good quality. But then we need to take some of those elements that we talked about in the first part of this episode, some of those basic kind of, I'd say, again, paint by number rules, apply them to the tree, and then branch out from there. So again, it's not that those rules are bad and we should disregard them entirely. They do need to be applied in some sense to the tree to get you an initial sort of starting point, but the tree itself needs to sort of build itself out, so to speak. Now, we do that through, again, manipulating branches, pruning branches back, wiring branches, defoliating, but the tree in some sense is going to grow as it's going to grow. It's going to shed branches, it's going to maybe lose an apex, it's going to maybe get a wound on the trunk somehow through some sort of disease or pest infestation. And all of these elements can be used and manipulated in a way to build the tree out and give the viewer a sense of grandeur and of age and of beauty and of, again, that gut punch factor that you as a viewer feel when you view that bonsai. Now, another factor that I think makes a tree memorable as a bonsai is this idea of what's called mochikomi in Japanese, which we've talked about here on the Bonsai-U platform in previous episodes. But it's this idea that the tree feels sort of settled as a bonsai, meaning that the branches feel like they're in the right spot, refined but natural. You know that the tree was built by man, but it has this very naturalistic sense to it. Now this is different from the idea of building a naturalistic bonsai that some professionals have sort of built out as their approach to doing bonsai, which quite often looks quite messy in my opinion and unkempt. We're not talking about that type of naturalistic, we're talking about naturalistic but refined. So again, you know that the tree has been manipulated by a person, but the final results feel settled and complete and very naturalistic again. So the branches look like they emerge naturally from the right locations within the tree. Again, sometimes they cross, sometimes you get a bit of a pigeon breast to the trunk, but there's just a feeling that the tree gives you that it is what it is and it's completed, right? I mean, we know in bonsai art that trees are never really completed until they're dead, right? This is a common phrase that you hear, and it really is true because the bonsai again will shed branches, shed apexes, whole portions of the trunk may die. So the tree is forever changing. But through that process of changing, the tree ages, both in appearance and physically as well. And you can start to feel this sense of, again, a settledness to the overall aesthetic appearance of the tree. And I think this is one thing that you can apply or think about when it comes to assessing whether or not a tree is good or of good quality. Another thing that I think is very useful when assessing whether or not a tree is good quality or a good bonsai is the difficulty factors. So how difficult was it to build the tree into the state that you currently see it? Now, for me specifically, this applies to deciduous material, especially smooth bark deciduous trees like Stewartia or Japanese maple. If I see one of those species built out with a scarless trunk, for example, but still beautiful taper, beautiful refined ramification, a beautiful branch structure in a winter silhouette form, I'm much more impressed with the tree as being a quality bonsai than I would be if I saw a tree that had massive scars on the trunk, for example, where it was obvious that it was trunk chopped at some point to build out the taper within the tree. Same thing when it comes to, let's say, junipers that have been grafted. If they're expertly grafted, you won't be able to see the graft sites and it will look incredibly realistic, incredibly naturalistic, but you know that the tree has been grafted because perhaps the deadwood characteristics don't match the foliar characteristics. You would never see that in nature. But having been grafted, it's impossible to tell where those graft sites are. So the difficulty factor, the expertise and the skill level of the artist that went into building that tree is something I think that you should take into consideration when assessing whether or not a bonsai is of good quality. All right, so next up here, let's talk about some of these concepts as applied to selecting material and more specifically to looking at raw yamadori like this Rocky Mountain juniper right here. Now, one of the best things to really look for, aside from obviously all the movement and all the character in the tree, is whether or not the tree is what would be referred to as a hone no iki in Japanese, or a tree with good bone structure. So what does that mean exactly? Well, from my perspective, what that means is it doesn't necessarily fall into this idea of, again, this left, right, back cookie cutter type bonsai that you're gonna see in mass production nurseries. What it refers to is, do the pads or does the foliage end up in the right place, really right from the get-go? So when you pull a tree out of the mountains, does it have all of the features that you're looking for, both internally in terms of the trunk movement and whatnot, and also can we build, essentially that sort of scalene triangle shape out of the foliage without having to do a ridiculous amount of manipulation throughout the tree? So just to break down these terms here, or this term hone no iki, hone refers to bones, I refers to good, and the no is a possessive, so a tree with good bones. Right, so I've had a few trees come through my nursery here in Nashville. Over the last few years, it really did have this great bone structure to them. I'd say probably one of the main ones, which is a bit of an unconventional tree in terms of typical bonsai design, was our famous Rocky Mountain juniper that had the zigzag form to the trunk. Nothing on that tree really needed heavy manipulation, although I did move a big branch in the back of the tree into a new spot. But in general, pretty much everything was in the right spot, and it was just a matter of manipulating that into the correct growing position so that it turned out to be the best tree possible. Now this is another tree right here, this Rocky Mountain juniper, that is, in my opinion, a Hone no Iki, again, a tree with good bone structure. The movement in the trunk is absolutely insane on this tree. It's short, squat, compact. The apex is directly over the base of the tree. It's got amazing movement with the shari and the deadwood and the live vein sort of intertwining within the trunk structure of the tree. And the branches basically are already in this sort of natural scalene triangle shape. So to build out a tree like this is actually very easy. Nothing will have to be manipulated heavily. It's just going to require a basic sort of detail wiring to put things in the right spot. And this tree has never been touched. It was collected 1 year ago, maybe about 1.5 years ago, by the guys at Backcountry Bonsai out in Wyoming. Came here last fall, so it's been in Nashville for about a year. And nothing's been done to it other than cleaning up the trunk and cleaning out some unnecessary foliage areas like the crotch growth, for example, in some areas of the plant. But no wire has really been put on this tree at all, other than a little bit on this branch right here, just to get it up towards the light, this last year, so we could keep it healthy. But stylistically, nothing has been done to this plant. But you can see it already has that basic scalene triangle structure to it. And again, all of the branches are soft, they're emanating from good locations within the tree, and it's going to make an instantly classic and beautiful bonsai. Now, the one thing you might notice that's a little bit different about this tree is that giant jin feature that's sticking out on the left-hand side. This, in some instances, let's say in Japan, for example, might be viewed as too long and too prominent. As you see it right now, it's kind of hard to tell because the big directional pad on the left side sort of breaks up that jin. But once this tree gets styled, that jin will become much more prominent. And it's going to be up to me styling this tree to make sure that I hide certain portions of that jin to keep it from overtaking the overall composition here and drawing your eye too much to that location. So if this were in Japan, I have a feeling that that jin on the far left side would probably be shortened significantly, but I do not want to do that, and the owner of this tree does not want me to do that because it's such an interesting and unique feature. So this, I think partly stems from Japan being a very small country, and it's very hard to keep extremely long jins like that. And also Japan sort of, aesthetically, like we talked about before, tending much more towards kind of a subtle appearance. Even with wild and crazy junipers like this, there's still sort of this move towards a little bit of subtlety within the plant. So that jin on the left-hand side is very loud, very big. It will be very prominent in the overall design. But for me, as an American building this out in an American context here, I want to leave that. The bigger, the better, the louder, the more in your face, the more tension we can create in the tree, the more interest we can add to the plant, even if it's a bit annoying to move the tree and to maintain the tree with a big feature like that. I think it adds to the uniqueness of this plant, right? Because if I were to cut off that branch on the far left side of the tree, or that deadwood on the far left side of the tree would still be amazing, but it would have much more of a simple kind of informal upright, maybe slightly semi-cascading with that big left branch there, appearance to it stylistically. Whereas keeping that on there, it adds a whole different element to the character of the tree and makes it a standout and memorable plant. So from my perspective, keeping some features on the tree that might be otherwise obnoxious is sometimes a good thing. We don't always have to bring things back into this, again, sort of perfect scalene triangle, not only with the foliage, but also with the additional features that are on the plant. Now, one additional thing that I think will really influence how you view bonsai and whether or not you assess a certain tree as being quality and memorable is going to be your own personal cultural context. So in the Japanese context here, things like subtlety, for example, things like age, elements like wabi-sabi, yugen, all of these components are sort of naturally ingrained in the mindset of the Japanese, again being raised in this specific cultural context. And when they assess a tree, those are the things that they're looking for built into the plant. And this is why the trees in Japan look the way they do. It's not because of some formulaic approach that has built those trees here. It's because of the cultural context, the way that they view art, this sort of communal understanding of what art and aesthetics is. This is why trees look the way they look here in Japan. So my main goal in this episode was to show you that it's not about building trees by some sort of formulaic approach, and that's not why those plants look the way they do here in Japan. It's much, much deeper than that. And I think as bonsai evolves in different cultural contexts around the world, both in the United States and in Europe and in the Southern Hemisphere as well, you're going to see different aesthetic ideals applied to trees and different sort of approaches to quality emerge as a result of that. Now, this is a little bit dangerous in some sense because it sort of gives people the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder exclusively. And if I build a tree the way I want to build it and I think it's beautiful, that's all that really matters. But I think all of us are pretty aware that there is good art and there is bad art. And I think all of us as human beings have a certain visceral reaction to ugliness and ugly art, as well as a visceral reaction in a positive sense to quality art and things that are beautiful. And this applies to bonsai art as well. So I hope that this episode has helped open your eyes to how to start assessing whether or not a tree is good quality. Again, it's a very difficult subject to discuss because of the subjective nature of bonsai as art. But take all of these elements with a grain of salt as you begin building your own trees and as you begin assessing trees at exhibitions like the Kokufu 10 if you ever do come here to Japan. So thank you guys so much for checking out this episode. Look forward to seeing all of you guys next time around. And until then, take care. All right, so what then? Oh God. It's a pigeon. Okay.